The kingdom of Vyre prided itself on strength. Powerful alphas ruled its military. Noble families controlled its wealth. The royal council directed its politics. And somewhere beneath all of that, buried under endless reports, records, and forgotten paperwork, worked Lyra Ashburn. Most people in the palace barely noticed her, which was exactly how she preferred it. For 3 years, Lyra served as one of the Royal Archives' senior records keepers. Her office sat in a quiet corner of the administrative wing, where important documents arrived in towering stacks and left neatly organized before anyone realized they had ever been a problem. The work was endless. Trade agreements, military reports, tax records, council decisions, border disputes. Every piece of information flowing through the kingdom eventually passed through Lyra's hands. And somehow, she managed to keep everything from falling apart. Not that anyone ever praised her for it. A noble received credit when negotiations succeeded. A general received recognition when military campaigns ended well. Council advisors were congratulated when political disasters were avoided. Meanwhile, the woman who spent nights discovering missing documents, correcting dangerous errors, and quietly preventing crises remained invisible. Lyra had long ago accepted that reality. Invisible people survived palace politics longer. People noticed ambitious women. People feared influential women. People targeted important women. But invisible women were left alone, at least most of the time. Late one afternoon, Lyra sat at her desk reviewing shipment records from the Eastern Territories when a junior clerk rushed into the archive room looking panicked. "My lady, I think there's a mistake." Lyra looked up immediately. "What kind of mistake?" The young man placed several documents on her desk. "The grain import numbers don't match." Lyra scanned the pages quickly. Within seconds, she found the problem. Someone had copied one figure incorrectly 3 months earlier. A single number, small enough to overlook, large enough to create a food shortage projection for 2 entire regions. The clerk's face paled. "Should I report it?" Lyra reached for a pen. "I'll fix it." The clerk hesitated. "Shouldn't someone know you caught it?" Lyra simply corrected the documents. If the problem disappears, nobody needs to know it existed. The clerk stared at her. "You save people a lot of trouble." Lyra smiled faintly. "And that's enough." The young man left, shaking his head. Lyra returned to work. Outside her office window, the palace buzzed with activity. Servants hurried through corridors. Nobles attended meetings. Messengers carried urgent reports. Everyone moving, everyone important, everyone visible. And none of them realized how many disasters never reached them because someone hidden inside the archives quietly solved them first. Hours later, darkness settled across the palace. Most employees returned to their quarters. Lyra remained. Again, a mountain of council records still needed filing before morning. By the time she finally finished organizing the last stack, the palace had fallen nearly silent. She gathered the completed files into her arms and headed toward the Royal Archive vault. The corridor was empty, the air cool. Only distant torchlight illuminated the stone walls. Lyra walked carefully through the quiet passageways until voices drifted toward her from farther ahead. Male voices, several of them. She recognized the location immediately. The strategy chamber, one of the few places still occupied this late. Normally, she would continue walking without paying attention. Palace conversations rarely improved anyone's life. Then she recognized one particular voice. Deep, steady, commanding, without effort. Alpha King Kaelor Vyre. Lyra slowed slightly. The king was rarely awake this late, unless discussing military matters. Curious despite herself, she adjusted the files in her arms and continued toward the corridor intersection. Inside the chamber, laughter echoed briefly. Someone was teasing the king about something. Lyra wasn't interested. At least, that was what she told herself. Then she heard one of the generals ask a question that made her pause. "My king, when exactly are you planning to choose a mate?" The laughter inside grew louder. Lyra stopped walking. And, without realizing it, she began listening. Lyra should have kept walking. She knew that. Palace walls were full of conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. Most of them led to trouble. Yet somehow, her feet remained rooted to the corridor floor. Inside the strategy chamber, the generals continued laughing. "The entire kingdom wants an answer," one commander said. "Noble families are practically throwing daughters at the throne." Another snorted. "My niece sent 3 portraits this year." "Only 3?" a third asked. "That's restraint." More laughter followed. Lyra rolled her eyes despite herself. Some things never changed. The Alpha King was 29 years old, unmated, powerful, wealthy, and handsome. Half the kingdom wanted him married. The other half wanted him married to someone from their family. Inside the chamber, Kaelor's voice cut through the noise. "If you spent half this much energy on military reports, we'd have fewer problems." That earned another round of amusement. "We're serious, Your Majesty," one general said. "The council keeps asking." The council always asks. Because they're worried. Kaelor sounded unimpressed. "About what?" "Succession." A brief silence followed. Lyra shifted the files in her arms. That part was true. The subject appeared constantly in palace records, council discussions, noble petitions, political correspondence. Everyone seemed obsessed with the king's future mate. Finally, another commander spoke. "Fine. Ignore the council, ignore the nobles, ignore the kingdom." A pause. "But surely you've thought about it." Kaelor didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched long enough that Lyra assumed he intended to ignore the question entirely. Then he sighed. "Of course I've thought about it." The generals immediately seized victory. There it is. Finally. He's admitting it. Lyra shook her head slightly. Men truly became children around their friends. "What?" Kaelor asked dryly. "We've known you too long." Unfortunately, more laughter. Then one of the older generals spoke. "What are you looking for?" The room quieted. Even through the door, Lyra could feel the shift. The teasing had faded. Now they were genuinely curious. Apparently, so was she, because she still hadn't walked away. Kaelor was silent for several moments, long enough that the generals didn't interrupt. When he finally spoke, his voice was calmer, more thoughtful. "I'm not looking for perfection." One commander groaned dramatically. "That sounds like the beginning of a speech." "It isn't." "Then answer properly." Kaelor sighed again. "I want someone steady." The room quieted further. "Steady?" one general repeated. "Yes." "What does that mean?" Another pause. Then Kaelor answered carefully. "It means, when everyone else is panicking, she isn't." Lyra blinked. That wasn't the answer she expected. Most alpha nobles described beauty first, or bloodlines, or political alliances. Not that. Inside the room, one commander chuckled. "So you want someone boring?" "No." Kaelor's response came immediately. "I want someone reliable." The humor vanished. Even the generals seemed to recognize the seriousness behind the statement. Kaelor continued. "The kingdom already has enough people who create problems." A few laughs returned. "That's fair. I'd rather have someone who solves them." Something about the words made Lyra pause. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. Like the quality genuinely mattered. Like he'd spent time thinking about it. The generals noticed too. One leaned forward. "Specific." Kaelor ignored the comment. "I want someone practical." Meaning, someone who deals with reality instead of appearances. Another thoughtful pause. Then he added, Someone who notices details other people overlook. Lyra frowned slightly. The description felt oddly familiar. Not because she thought he was describing her. That would be ridiculous. But because she spent every day surrounded by people who ignored details until those details became disasters. Inside the room, one commander laughed softly. "You're describing a military strategist." "No." Kaylor's voice lowered slightly. "I'm describing someone observant." Something in the answer made the room fall quiet again. The generals were beginning to hear something beneath the words. And strangely, so was Lyra. Then, one of them asked, "Anything else?" A brief silence followed. And when Kaylor answered this time, his voice sounded softer than before. "Yes." Lyra's grip tightened slightly on the files, without understanding why, because suddenly, she wanted to hear the rest. The corridor seemed unusually quiet. Lyra stood motionless outside the strategy chamber, files pressed against her chest. While the conversation inside continued, she still should have left. Every sensible instinct told her that. Yet curiosity held her firmly in place. Inside the room, one of the generals laughed softly. "Now you've made us interested." Another agreed. "You don't talk about people this carefully, unless you've already thought about it." Kaylor sounded unimpressed. "I've thought about many things. Not like this." A brief silence followed. The generals clearly weren't planning to let the subject go. After several moments, Kaylor sighed. "You're all impossible. We've been called worse." That earned a few chuckles. Then the room quieted again, waiting. Eventually, Kaylor continued. "She doesn't need attention." Lyra frowned slightly. The answer surprised even the generals. "What?" Kaylor's voice remained calm. "She doesn't need every achievement announced to a room." One commander immediately laughed. "So definitely not a noble woman." Several others joined him. Kaylor ignored them. Instead, he continued speaking, almost as if he were thinking aloud. "She helps people because the work needs to be done." The room grew quieter. Not because someone might reward her. Something uncomfortable stirred inside Lyra's chest. The description still felt strangely familiar. Not because she imagined it was about her, because she knew people like that. Rare people. People who worked quietly, while others collected praise. Inside the room, one general spoke carefully. "That's oddly specific." Kaylor didn't answer. Another commander leaned forward. "You've met someone like this?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Every general noticed. Even Lyra noticed. A long silence followed. Then one commander laughed. That wasn't convincing. More amusement spread through the room. Kaylor sounded irritated. "I answered the question. You avoided the question." "I did not." "You absolutely did." The generals were enjoying this far too much. One of them spoke again. "If she exists, what else?" Kaylor was quiet for a moment. Then he answered. "She notices problems before they become disasters." Lyra blinked. The words hit unexpectedly. "Most people only react once something goes wrong." Kaylor's voice remained steady. "She pays attention before that happens." The room had become completely silent now. No teasing, no jokes. Even the generals seemed invested. Kaylor continued. "She's capable." "That's vague." "No." His voice hardened slightly. "It's not." A pause. Then, "She works harder than anyone around her." Something tightened in Lyra's chest. The description was becoming increasingly specific. Dangerously specific. Still, there were dozens of capable women in the kingdom. Dozens who worked hard. Dozens who remained unnoticed. Surely. One commander cleared his throat. "And after all this effort?" Kaylor answered immediately. "She acts like it's normal." Silence. The room froze briefly. Then one general finally spoke. "You definitely have someone in mind." "No." Again. Too fast. Too automatic. The denial only made the accusation more believable. Several commanders laughed knowingly. One finally said what everyone else was thinking. "You've been observing somebody." Kaelor didn't respond. That silence was answer enough. The generals noticed. Lyra noticed. And suddenly, the atmosphere inside the chamber shifted completely. The teasing was gone now, replaced by curiosity. One of the older commanders spoke carefully. "Let's assume this woman exists." Kaelor remained silent. The general continued anyway. "What'd she look like?" The room immediately quieted. Completely. Every voice vanished. Even through the thick chamber doors, Lyra could feel the weight of the question. Because describing qualities was one thing. Describing appearance was another. That required a real person. A specific person. A person Kaelor would have seen often enough to remember details. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Not the generals, not the king, not even Lyra. Then finally, Kaelor answered, and the first words out of his mouth made Lyra's heart stop. Dark hair. Her breath caught. The files shifted slightly in her arms. Inside the room, nobody interrupted. Nobody joked. Because suddenly, everyone understood this wasn't hypothetical anymore, and Kaelor wasn't finished. The silence inside the strategy chamber felt heavier than before. No one laughed. No one interrupted. The generals had finally received the answer they wanted, and judging by the sudden stillness, they understood exactly what it meant. Outside the chamber door, Lyra stood frozen. Her pulse had begun beating uncomfortably fast. This was no longer a theoretical conversation, no longer a discussion about vague qualities or imagined possibilities. The Alpha King was describing a real woman, someone he knew, someone he had noticed, someone he remembered. Inside the room, Kaelor's voice remained calm. Dark hair. A pause followed. One of the generals spoke carefully. Go on. More silence. Then Kaelor continued. Gray eyes. Lyra's breath caught. The files nearly slipped in her hands. Her eyes, gray. She stared at the stone wall beside her, as if it might somehow explain what was happening. Coincidence. That was all. Half the kingdom had dark hair. Gray eyes weren't uncommon. There was no reason to panic. No reason at all. Inside the room, one commander cleared his throat. And the pause that followed felt endless. Then Kaelor answered. Small scar near her left eyebrow. Everything stopped. The folder slipped from Lyra's hands. Papers exploded across the corridor floor. The sound shattered the silence like glass. Inside the strategy chamber, every voice vanished instantly. Lyra closed her eyes. For one brief moment, she considered running. It was a terrible plan, an impossible plan, and far too late. The chamber door opened before she could move. Light spilled into the corridor. Lyra stared down at the scattered documents surrounding her boots. Slowly, painfully, slowly. She lifted her gaze. Kaelor stood in the doorway. Behind him sat 5 generals, every one of them staring directly at her. The silence became unbearable. One commander looked from Lyra to Kaelor, then back to Lyra. His eyes widened slightly. Another general muttered something under his breath. A third looked like he was fighting very hard not to smile. Lyra wished the floor would open beneath her. Instead, she crouched immediately and began gathering papers, because apparently humiliation became easier if your hands were busy. I can explain, she said. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. Explain what? That she had accidentally overheard the king describing her face. There was no explanation capable of improving this situation. One of the generals abruptly stood. We should leave. Another immediately nodded. Excellent idea. A third rose from his chair. I suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. The remaining 2 followed just as quickly. Lyra watched in disbelief as trained military commanders fled the room like frightened rabbits. Cowards. every single one of them. Within moments, all 5 had disappeared through a side exit. Not one offered assistance. Not one offered sympathy. Traitors. The strategy chamber fell silent once again. Only this time, the silence belonged to 2 people, Lyra and Coilor. The worst possible outcome. She continued collecting documents. Carefully, methodically, avoiding eye contact at all costs. Maybe if she focused hard enough on the paperwork, reality would become less embarrassing. It did not. A shadow appeared beside her. Lyra looked up. Kaylor had crouched to help gather the fallen reports. For a second, neither spoke. The Alpha King picked up several scattered pages and handed them toward her. Their fingers brushed briefly. Both froze, only for a moment, but long enough to notice, long enough to make the situation even worse. Lyra accepted the papers quickly. "Thank you. You should have been asleep hours ago." The statement startled her. Of everything he could have said, that wasn't what she expected. "I had filing to finish." Kaylor nodded once. Of course she did. They both knew she always did. Another silence settled between them. Awkward, heavy, impossible to escape. Then Lyra realized something terrifying. He hadn't denied it. Not once. Not when the papers fell. Not when the generals fled. Not now. And suddenly, the question she was desperately avoiding became impossible to ignore. Because if Kaylor wasn't describing her, why hadn't he said so? The corridor felt far too small, far too quiet, far too intimate for a conversation Lyra never expected to have. The scattered reports had finally been collected. The documents were neatly stacked once more between them. Yet neither moved, neither left, as though both understood something important was waiting to be said, and neither quite knew how to begin. Kaylor rose first. Lyra followed a moment later. The Alpha King stood only a few feet away, his silver eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that made looking elsewhere feel impossible. For years, she had worked in the palace. For years, she had seen him during meetings, ceremonies, and council sessions, yet she couldn't remember him ever looking directly at her like this, actually seeing her, not as part of a room, not as part of a staff report, just her. The realization unsettled her more than the overheard conversation. Kaylor seemed equally uncertain, which somehow made everything stranger, because Alpha Kings were not supposed to look uncertain. They commanded armies, negotiated treaties, made decisions affecting entire kingdoms. Yet standing in a quiet palace corridor beside a records keeper seemed to have robbed him of every prepared answer. Lyra took a slow breath. There was only one way out of this, directly through it. "You described me." The words landed softly between them. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. Kaylor's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, acceptance, perhaps even relief. For a moment, he said nothing, and Lyra felt her heartbeat climbing steadily higher. Then finally, he nodded. Yes, one word. Simple, uncomplicated, completely devastating. Lyra stared at him. "You actually were." Another nod. "Yes." Her mind immediately rejected the answer, not because she thought he was lying, because it made no sense. The Alpha King of Vyre, one of the most powerful alphas in the continent, a man pursued relentlessly by noble families and influential houses, describing her, a records keeper, an archivist, a woman most people forgot was in the room 5 minutes after leaving it. Lyra folded her arms, partly for comfort, partly because she suddenly didn't know what to do with her hands. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it. Kaylor blinked. Why? Why me? Silence. For the first time since this conversation began, Kaylor looked genuinely caught off guard, as though he had expected every question except that one. Eventually, he answered. Because you're you. Lyra stared, then laughed once. A short, disbelieving sound. That's not an answer. A faint smile threatened the corner of Kaylor's mouth. Perhaps not. Definitely not. The smile became slightly more visible, and somehow that made him look less like a king and more like a man. A surprisingly dangerous distinction. Kaylor leaned lightly against the corridor wall. You solve problems before anyone else notices them. Lyra opened her mouth. He continued before she could interrupt. You've prevented at least 4 administrative crises this year. She blinked. How do you know that? You think I don't read reports? That wasn't the surprising part. The surprising part was that he remembered every example he mentioned afterward. The Eastern grain shortage, the border tax discrepancy, the shipping delays, the diplomatic scheduling conflict were issues she had corrected quietly months ago, issues nobody thanked her for, issues she assumed nobody remembered. Yet somehow, he did. Lyra stared at him. You noticed all that? Kaylor's expression softened slightly. I notice more than people think. The answer landed unexpectedly hard, because for 3 years, Lyra had built an entire life around being overlooked, invisible, forgettable, safe. Now, the Alpha King stood before her, calmly dismantling that belief, piece by piece. And the most unsettling part wasn't that he had noticed her. It was realizing how long he must have been paying attention. Long before tonight. Long before the conversation. Long before she ever suspected. For the first time, Lyra understood something that made her pulse quicken again. This wasn't a sudden realization. Kaylor hadn't accidentally described her. He had described her from memory. And that meant the Alpha King had been watching her for years. Long before she ever started watching him. For the rest of the night, Lyra barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the conversation replayed itself. Not the generals, not the awkward silence, not even the moment she dropped the documents. Just Kaylor's voice. You solve problems before anyone else notices them. I notice more than people think. The words refused to leave her alone. By dawn, she was already seated at her desk inside the archives, attempting to bury herself beneath a mountain of reports. Unfortunately, paperwork was proving unusually ineffective. Normally, records made sense. Problems appeared. Solutions followed. Everything fit neatly into categories. People, however, were proving significantly more difficult. A knock sounded against her office door. Before she could answer, her assistant entered, carrying a stack of correspondence. Then, immediately stopped. You look terrible. Lyra glanced up. Good morning to you, too. I'm serious. The younger woman frowned. You look like you argued with a ghost. In a way, I did. That only made her assistant more curious. Thankfully, before further questions could be asked, another clerk arrived with additional documents. Work resumed, and for several glorious hours, Lyra almost succeeded in forgetting the previous night. Almost. Then the palace rumors began. At first, they arrived quietly, a servant whispering in the hallway, 2 clerks exchanging knowing looks, an unusually curious glance from a council secretary. By lunchtime, Lyra realized something terrible. The generals had talked. Of course they had. She should have expected it. Men who commanded armies apparently possessed the gossip restraint of excited schoolchildren. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. By mid-afternoon, the whispers had spread across 3 administrative wings. Lyra considered moving to another kingdom. The idea had merit. Unfortunately, the kingdom's records would probably collapse without her. Late that evening, she finally escaped the archives and headed toward the library. It was one of the few places in the palace where people generally valued silence, at least normally. Today, however, she found Kaylor standing beside one of the upper balcony windows, alone. The moment she saw him, she considered retreating, Too late. He had already noticed her. For a brief second, neither moved. Then Kalor stepped away from the window. Lyra, Your Majesty. The formal title felt strange after the previous night. Apparently, he thought so too. His expression tightened slightly. Neither mentioned it. An uncomfortable silence settled between them. Finally, Lyra sighed. This is a problem. Kalor raised an eyebrow. What is? She stared at him. He knew exactly what. Unfortunately, he seemed determined to make her say it. This, Lyra gestured vaguely between them. The conversation, the rumors, the entire disaster. Kalor remained frustratingly calm. I disagree. Of course he did. You're the Alpha King. And? Lyra stared at him. That is not an appropriate response. His expression almost suggested amusement, which only irritated her further. She folded her arms. Half the noble families in the kingdom are trying to marry their daughters to you. I know. The council expects a political alliance. I know. The court will lose its mind if these rumors continue. I know. Lyra exhaled sharply. Then how is this not a problem? For the first time, Kalor's expression became serious. Completely serious. His silver eyes held hers steadily. Because none of those things change who you are. The answer struck harder than she expected. Not because it solved anything. Because it sounded genuine. Kalor stepped closer. Not enough to invade her space. Just enough to ensure she couldn't avoid his gaze. You keep describing yourself as a records keeper. I am a records keeper. You're also the person who keeps half this palace functioning. Lyra looked away briefly. Compliments made her uncomfortable, especially when they came from him. Kalor noticed. Of course, he noticed. He seemed to notice everything lately. Why does everyone else's opinion matter more than yours? He asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. She frowned. What? You care what the nobles think. Because they're nobles. You care what the council thinks. Because they influence the kingdom. Kalor's voice softened. But you don't seem to care what I think. The words settled heavily between them. And, for the first time, Lyra realized something dangerous. This conversation wasn't only changing her understanding of Kalor. It was changing his understanding of himself. Because the more he spoke, the more obvious it became that the Alpha King was only now beginning to understand why her opinion mattered so much to him. By the end of the week, the rumors had become impossible to contain. What began as whispers in palace corridors quickly transformed into full-scale speculation throughout the royal court. Servants talked, clerks talked, advisors talked, and unfortunately, nobles talked the most. Lyra discovered this firsthand during a council records meeting when 3 noble women abruptly stopped speaking the moment she entered the room. They smiled, far too quickly, far too politely. The kind of smiles people wore when they had been discussing you moments earlier. Lyra pretended not to notice. Years inside the palace had taught her many survival skills. Ignoring stupidity was one of them. Unfortunately, ignoring stupidity did not make it disappear. The situation only worsened. Within days, invitations that normally never reached her desk suddenly began appearing. Political gatherings, charity functions, social dinners, events that records keepers were never invited to. Lyra declined every single one. The invitations continued arriving anyway, like vultures circling something they hoped might die or succeed, depending on which noble family sent them. The worst part wasn't the curiosity, it was the hostility, because many people had already decided what the rumors meant, and they hated it. One afternoon, Lyra entered the archives to discover 2 visiting noblewomen speaking with one of the junior clerks. Their conversation stopped immediately when she appeared. Neither woman bothered hiding their disappointment. One looked her up and down, openly. That's her? The second noblewoman frowned. I expected someone more impressive. Lyra continued walking. The clerk looked horrified. The noblewomen looked pleased. Neither reaction surprised her. For years, the court had built elaborate expectations around the Alpha King's future mate. A warrior princess, a noble heiress, a powerful alpha from a prestigious bloodline. Someone useful, someone impressive, someone political. Not a woman whose greatest accomplishment involved correcting shipping manifests before breakfast. Unfortunately for them, Kaelor appeared increasingly uninterested in their expectations, and that fact terrified certain families. Leading the opposition was Lady Seraphine Valmont, daughter of one of the wealthiest alpha houses in the kingdom, beautiful, educated, politically connected, and completely convinced she belonged beside the throne. Seraphine had spent the last 2 years as the court's unofficial favorite candidate for future Luna. Not because Kaelor encouraged it, because everyone else did. Her family certainly did. The council occasionally did. Half the kingdom practically treated the match as inevitable. Then, Lyra happened, and suddenly, a woman nobody considered competition had become a threat. The realization did not improve Seraphine's mood. 3 days later, Lyra encountered her for the first time. The meeting occurred inside the palace gardens. Unfortunately, Seraphine was surrounded by several noble companions when Lyra passed by. The conversation stopped immediately. Never a good sign. Seraphine smiled. The expression was beautiful and completely insincere. Lady Lyra paused. Technically, she wasn't a lady. Apparently, facts no longer mattered. Lady Seraphine. The noblewoman examined her carefully, like someone evaluating an unexpected stain. I've heard so much about you lately. Lyra already disliked where this was heading. I'm sorry to hear that. A few nearby nobles laughed despite themselves. Seraphine's smile tightened. Only slightly, but enough. You're amusing. I organize tax reports. I suppose everyone needs hobbies. The insult landed exactly as intended. Several nobles smirked. Lyra remained calm. People often mistook calmness for weakness, a mistake she stopped correcting years ago. Seraphine stepped closer. The court seems fascinated by you recently. Lyra offered a polite smile. The court needs better entertainment. A few suppressed laughs appeared again. This time, Seraphine definitely noticed. The noblewoman's eyes cooled considerably. Careful. The warning sounded deceptively gentle. You may begin believing attention is the same thing as importance. Silence settled around them. Several nobles suddenly looked uncomfortable, because even they recognized the cruelty. Lyra held Seraphine's gaze steadily, then answered softly, "Then we're fortunate attention isn't something I've ever depended on." The response struck harder than expected. Seraphine's expression froze briefly, not because Lyra had raised her voice, because she hadn't. The calm answer denied her the confrontation she wanted, and somehow made the insult look petty. For the first time, Seraphine appeared genuinely annoyed. Lyra recognized the look immediately. This wasn't over, not even close. As she continued walking toward the archives, she could practically feel Seraphine watching her leave. The noblewoman had decided something today, something dangerous, and deep down, Lyra suspected the coming winter banquet would be where she acted on it. The winter banquet was the most exhausting event of the year, at least in Lyra's opinion. The nobles called it elegant. The council called it important. The palace newspapers called it prestigious. Lyra called it 6 hours of smiling at people who secretly disliked each other. Unfortunately, attendance was mandatory, especially this year, which meant there was no escaping it. By sunset, the grand ballroom glittered beneath thousands of crystal lights. Musicians played softly from an elevated gallery. Servants moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays. Every noble family of significance had gathered beneath the palace roof, and every one of them seemed eager to witness whatever happened next, because rumors had reached far beyond palace walls. The entire kingdom wanted answers. Lyra was painfully aware of it. The moment she entered the ballroom, conversations shifted. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to notice. People watched, whispered, speculated, exactly as expected. She ignored them, mostly. The strategy worked for nearly an hour. Then Lady Seraphine decided otherwise. Lyra had just accepted a glass of sparkling wine when she noticed the noblewoman approaching. Several companions followed behind her. An audience, of course. Public humiliation required witnesses. Seraphine's smile appeared flawless. Lady Lyra. Lyra resisted the urge to sigh. Lady Seraphine. The surrounding nobles immediately grew interested, like wolves scenting blood. Seraphine lifted her glass lightly. I heard another fascinating rumor today. Lyra took a small sip of wine. Congratulations. Several nearby people coughed suspiciously into their drinks. Seraphine's smile tightened. Again, the reaction was becoming familiar. You're quite confident lately. I organize paperwork. Lyra answered smoothly. It would be concerning if paperwork made me nervous. A few nobles laughed. This time, even Seraphine's companions struggled to hide their amusement. The noblewoman's patience visibly thinned. Excellent. Tell me something. Her voice softened. Dangerously. Do you actually believe these stories? Lyra already knew which stories. The palace produces many stories. Don't play innocent. The smile vanished completely now. You know exactly what I mean. The surrounding crowd grew quieter. People pretended not to listen. Nobody succeeded. Seraphine stepped closer. You honestly think the Alpha King would choose someone like you? Silence. Immediate. Complete. Every conversation within hearing distance stopped. Lyra remained calm. Outwardly. Inside, she was considering several possible responses. Most of them inappropriate. One of them involved throwing wine. Instead, she settled for honesty. I haven't claimed anything. Convenient answer. It's also true. Seraphine laughed softly. The sound held no warmth whatsoever. You're a records keeper. The insult arrived, wrapped inside a statement. You were never meant to stand beside a throne. Several nobles shifted. Uncomfortably. Others looked pleased. A few appeared embarrassed. No one interrupted. Not yet. Seraphine continued. Do you know what makes this amusing? Lyra remained silent. The noblewoman smiled. You actually seem surprised people are questioning it. The words struck harder than intended. Not because they hurt, because they reflected something Lyra already knew. People like Seraphine measured worth through status, titles, bloodlines, influence, everything except character. Unfortunately, before Lyra could answer, another voice interrupted. A deep voice, calm, dangerously controlled. He would. The ballroom froze. Instantly, every head turned toward the entrance, and there stood Alpha King Kalor Vyre. The crowd parted automatically, like water moving around stone. His silver eyes locked directly onto Seraphine. Not Lyra, Seraphine. The noblewoman visibly paled. Only slightly, but enough. Because she recognized what everyone else suddenly understood. The Alpha King had heard her. Not part of the conversation. Not a fragment. Everything. The entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Kalor crossed the floor slowly, purposefully, past nobles, past advisors, past every politically acceptable match in the kingdom. He never hesitated, never looked elsewhere, never slowed, until he stopped directly beside Lyra. The silence became almost painful. Seraphine attempted a smile. A mistake. My king, we were merely discussing. I heard enough. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Kaler's voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Authority rarely required volume. The ballroom stood motionless, waiting, watching, because everyone knew something important was about to happen. And for the first time all evening, Seraphine looked genuinely worried. Nobody in the ballroom moved. Nobody spoke. Even the musicians had fallen silent. The only sound came from the distant crackle of the enormous fireplaces lining the walls. Kaler stood beside Lyra, not in front of her, not protecting her like she was fragile. Beside her, an equal position, and somehow, that simple choice made the room even more uncomfortable, because everyone understood what it meant. Seraphine attempted to recover first. Years of noble training demanded it. "My king," she said carefully, "I believe there has been a misunderstanding." Kaler looked at her. His expression revealed absolutely nothing. What part was misunderstood? The question landed like a blade. Several nobles immediately looked away. Seraphine hesitated, only for a moment. Then she forced a smile. "We were simply discussing the responsibilities of someone standing near the throne." "No." Kaler's voice remained calm. "You were discussing whether she deserved respect." The ballroom became even quieter, if that was somehow possible. Seraphine's companions suddenly seemed fascinated by their wine glasses. Cowards, every one of them. Kaler turned slowly toward the gathered nobles. His silver eyes swept across the room, watching, measuring, evaluating, and judging by the growing discomfort around him. Many people disliked the results. "You all keep discussing status." Nobody interrupted. Nobody dared. Kaler continued, "As though bloodlines automatically create character." The statement struck several noble families directly. A few visibly stiffened. "Good." Lyra remained completely still beside him, partly because she was shocked, partly because she had no idea where this was going. Kaler wasn't finished. Not even close. "You speak about titles." A pause. "You speak about influence." Another pause. "You speak about political value." The room remained frozen. Then Kaler looked toward Lyra, and everything changed. His voice softened slightly. Not enough to sound weak, just enough to sound honest. "You know what I see?" Nobody answered. The question wasn't meant for them. Kaler answered it himself. "I see someone who has solved more problems for this kingdom than half the council combined." Several council members immediately looked uncomfortable. Because it was true. Lyra had corrected their mistakes for years. Quietly, consistently, without recognition, without complaint. Kaler continued, "I see someone who prevented trade failures." Another pause. Border disputes. Another. Administrative disasters. The nobles shifted uneasily. Many of them had benefited directly from Lyra's work without ever knowing it, or caring, until now. Kaler's gaze never left her, and she never once asked for credit. The words struck Lyra unexpectedly hard, because that was the part nobody ever understood. She never wanted praise, never demanded recognition, never expected rewards. She simply believed important work should be done. Apparently, Kaler had noticed. For years, the realization left her strangely speechless. Seraphine tried one final time. "My king, surely capability isn't the only consideration." "It isn't." Hope flickered briefly across her face. Then Kaler destroyed it. "Trust matters too." The hope vanished. Completely. Kaler's eyes hardened. "I trust Lyra." Silence. Heavy. Absolute. Every person in the ballroom understood the significance immediately. Trust. Not attraction. Not curiosity. Trust. A quality infinitely harder to earn, especially from a king. Kaler finally turned toward her fully. For one brief moment, the rest of the ballroom seemed to disappear. The nobles, the council, the whispers, all of it faded away. leaving only two people standing beneath the crystal lights. Then, Kaylor extended his hand. Simple, steady, a choice. Nothing more, nothing less. The entire room held its breath, because everyone understood what was happening. Not a declaration, not an engagement, not a command. A choice. He wasn't deciding for her. He was asking, and somehow that mattered more than any royal proclamation ever could. Lyra stared at the offered hand, then at Kaylor, then back again. Her heart was beating entirely too fast, because for the first time since this began, she realized something important. The Alpha King wasn't choosing her tonight. He had chosen her long ago. Tonight was simply the first time everyone else was seeing it, including her. Slowly, Lyra reached out and took his hand. The ballroom erupted. The ballroom erupted into whispers the moment Lyra took Kaylor's hand. Not quiet whispers, not subtle whispers. The kind that rolled across a room like a storm. Shock, disbelief, curiosity, outrage. Every emotion appeared at once. Several nobles looked horrified. Others appeared fascinated. A surprising number seemed relieved, as though the mystery that had consumed the palace for weeks had finally received an answer. Kaylor ignored all of them. Completely. His attention remained fixed on Lyra, and for perhaps the first time in her life, she understood what it felt like to be the center of a room. She disliked it immediately. The realization almost made her laugh. After all this chaos, all this drama, all this speculation, she was still a records keeper at heart, and records keepers preferred shelves to spotlights. Fortunately, Kaylor seemed to understand that. He released her hand after only a moment, not because he regretted it, because he knew she needed space to breathe. The gesture somehow meant more than holding on would have. Across the ballroom, Seraphine finally turned and left, not dramatically, not loudly, simply gone. The nobles surrounding her followed quickly. One by one, the opposition had lost, and everyone knew it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. People approached, offered congratulations, attempted conversations, tried very hard to appear supportive, despite having spent weeks criticizing her. Lyra survived it somehow, mostly because Kaylor remained nearby, not hovering, not controlling, present, steady, a quiet reassurance that she wasn't facing the madness alone. Hours later, when the final guests began leaving, Lyra finally escaped to one of the palace balconies. The cool night air felt glorious after the crowded ballroom. Below, the capital stretched toward the horizon. Thousands of lights glittered beneath the darkness. Beautiful, peaceful, unaware of the political earthquake that had just occurred inside the palace. "You disappeared." Kaylor's voice came from behind her. Lyra smiled faintly. "I needed 5 minutes without nobles. A reasonable request." He stepped beside her. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable now. No longer awkward. No longer uncertain. Just quiet. The way silence should be. Eventually, Lyra glanced toward him. "You know this changes everything." Kaylor leaned against the stone railing. "I know. The council will panic. Probably. The nobles will complain. Definitely. The newspapers are going to be unbearable." That finally earned a laugh. A real one. Warm. Genuine. The sound surprised both of them. Lyra found herself smiling, then shaking her head. "All of this because I couldn't hold on to a folder." Kaylor's eyes softened. "No." The single word carried surprising certainty. Lyra looked at him curiously. Kaylor gazed out across the city lights. This started long before that. A gentle breeze moved through the balcony. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then, Lyra asked the question she had been thinking about for days. "When did you realize?" Kaylor didn't need clarification. He knew exactly what she meant. The answer came quietly. I don't know. Lyra raised an eyebrow. Convenient. It's true. He smiled slightly. One day you were simply part of the palace. A pause. Then somehow you became the person I looked for first, when something happened. The admission settled softly between them. Honest, unpolished, real. Kaelor continued. I trusted your judgment. Another pause. I valued your opinion. Then, and eventually, I realized I paid attention to you more than anyone else. Lyra's heartbeat quickened slightly. Not because the words were dramatic, because they weren't. There were no grand speeches, no impossible promises, just truth. And somehow, truth felt more powerful. Below them, the city lights shimmered beneath the night sky. For a moment, neither looked away. Finally, Lyra smiled. A small smile, but real. You spent years searching for a perfect mate. Kaelor turned toward her. No. The answer came immediately. Certain, without hesitation. His silver eyes met hers. I spent years standing beside her. The breeze carried the silence that followed. Warm, comfortable, certain. Because the Alpha King search had never truly been a search at all. The woman he wanted had never been hidden, never been distant, never been impossible to find. She had simply spent years working quietly beside him, waiting for him to recognize what he was looking at. And now that he finally had, neither of them intended to look away again.